You hear the name Dracula, and a certain image just pops into your head, right? A creature of the night, a symbol of terror. But what if I told you the story you think you know is just a shadow? Today, we're gonna peel back all those layers of legend and find the real man hiding underneath.
I mean, seriously, ask anyone. It's a name we all know. It's woven into our books, our movies, pretty much our collective nightmares.
And there he is, the dark cloak, the fangs, that whole aristocratic predator vibe. He's not just a vampire, he is the vampire, the blueprint for all the rest.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting, because long before the fiction, there was a real historical person whose actual life was, you could argue, way more terrifying than any vampire story.
So, to separate the man from this monster myth, we have to start with his name. Because for the real Vlad, the name Dracula wasn't some kind of curse, it was his birthright.
Yeah, this really flips the whole script. See, Vlad's father was part of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian group of knights whose whole purpose was fighting the Ottoman Empire. His dad's title was Vlad Dracula, which meant Vlad the Dragon. So Dracula just means son of the dragon. It was literally a badge of honor. The fact that the modern Romanian word for devil is Drac, well, that's just a dark and totally coincidental twist of history.
To really get who this guy was, you have to look at his childhood. And let me tell you, it was not a fairy tale. It was a brutal, first-hand education in power, survival, and betrayal.
Just look at this timeline. His life was basically forged in violence. When he was just 11 years old, he and his little brother were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as political pawns. And while he's a hostage, his own father and older brother are murdered, not by the Ottomans, but by their so-called Christian allies in Hungary. The lesson he learned must have been crystal clear. Trust absolutely no one. The only thing that keeps you safe is absolute power.
You know, those years he spent in captivity, it was a real double-edged sword. Sure, he was a prisoner, but he was also a student. He learned to speak fluent Turkish, he studied Ottoman military strategy from the inside, and he saw firsthand how their politics worked. He was basically getting a masterclass in how to defeat the very empire that held him captive. No other European leader had that kind of insight.
And this, of course, brings us to the thing he's most famous for, his calculated, brutal use of cruelty. But to even begin to understand it, we have to look at the world he was living in.
Now, this is a really crucial point. The laws in Vlad's own kingdom of Wallachia were actually pretty lenient for the time. But right next door, in the German and Hungarian territories, justice was, well, it was a public spectacle of horror. We're talking breaking people on the wheel, mutilation, and yep, impalement. So Vlad didn't actually invent this stuff. He adopted it and perfected it for his own purposes. And listen to this quote from an official at the time. He's talking to some merchants, and he's basically saying, "You guys started this." When Vlad's enemies started impaling his supporters, Vlad's response was to take their own weapon of terror and turn it back on them, but on a scale they could never have imagined.
The actual mechanics of it just reveals how cold and calculated it was. It was designed to be a slow, agonizing death. The stake would intentionally miss the vital organs to prolong the suffering, sometimes for days. This wasn't just an execution, it was terrifying public theater. It was a message designed to be absolutely unforgettable. So you have to understand, the impalements were never random acts of madness. For Vlad, it was a multi-purpose tool of statecraft. He used it as psychological warfare against invaders. He used it to enforce absolute order and crush crime at home. He used it to wipe out the nobles who had betrayed his family. And, like we saw, he used it for pure eye-for-an-eye retaliation.
All right, now let's see how he used this terrifying weapon of fear against the single greatest superpower of his day, the massive Ottoman Empire. So when Sultan Mehmed II, we're talking about the guy who conquered Constantinople, marched on Vlad's territory, Vlad was massively outnumbered. He couldn't win a straight-up fight, so he waged total war. He burned his own villages to deny the enemy food, he poisoned wells, and he even, incredibly, weaponized the bubonic plague by sending infected people into the Ottoman camps. He just refused to fight their game, choosing instead to bleed their giant army with constant hit-and-run attacks.
Look at this number. This comes from a letter Vlad himself wrote to the King of Hungary. It's the body count. The number of Turks and Bulgarians he claimed to have killed during one single, unbelievably audacious winter campaign when he crossed the frozen Danube River and raided deep into enemy territory. He wasn't just defending his home, he was taking the fight to them.
And then there's this This sounds like something out of a movie, but it really happened. Using that Turkish he learned as a boy, Vlad disguised himself and a few of his best men, snuck into the heavily guarded Ottoman camp in the middle of the night, and tried to kill the Sultan himself in his tent. Now, he didn't find Mehmed, but the attack caused absolute chaos. The Ottoman soldiers started fighting and killing each other in the dark, completely terrified.
And this was the checkmate. When Mehmed's army finally got near Vlad's capital, they were met by a sight that is just unimaginable. A huge field, a literal forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish prisoners of war. The psychological blow was so huge that even Mehmed the Conqueror, a man who had seen everything, reportedly turned his army right around and left. I mean, that quote from his biggest enemy says it all, doesn't it? It's the ultimate proof of how terrifyingly effective Vlad's methods were.
His methods worked, for sure, but they also created a reputation that his other enemies were all too happy to use against him.
And here's the great paradox of his life, right? He's out there on the front lines, holding back the Ottoman tide, basically doing a favor for all of Christendom. So why on earth would his most powerful Christian ally betray him and toss him in a dungeon for over a decade?
The answer is just dirty politics. The Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, had taken a ton of money from the Pope to fund a big crusade against the Ottomans, but he never actually did it. So, to cover his tracks and get rid of Vlad, who was a political headache, he just faked a bunch of letters that made it look like Vlad was a traitor, secretly allied with the Sultan. It was a brilliant and absolutely devastating smear campaign.
And that smear campaign, thanks to the new technology of the printing press, basically created two completely different versions of Vlad. In Western Europe, German pamphlets, the bestsellers of their day, spread these wild stories about a sadistic monster who boiled people alive and ate dinner surrounded by his victims. But back in Russia and Romania, the stories passed down told of a different man. A harsh ruler, yeah, but a just one. A fierce defender of his people. So his reputation completely depended on who was telling the story.
So how in the world did this complicated, divisive historical figure become the king of all vampires?
Well, here's the final twist. The whole vampire connection is almost completely disconnected from the real man. It wasn't until almost 400 years after Vlad died that an Irish writer named Bram Stoker was doing research for a new horror novel. He stumbled across the name Dracula and a few of the gory details from history. He just borrowed the name and the setting, but the entire vampire story, the blood drinking, the immortality, the fear of the cross, that was all pure invention.
So in the end, we're left with this incredibly complex and brutal figure. He's a national hero to some and a literal demon to others. The vampire might be fiction, but the man who sparked the myth is a pretty stark reminder that real history is often way more terrifying than any legend. So what was he? A monster? A patriot? Or was he simply a master of fear, perfectly made for a brutal, unforgiving world?